Hey, Little Top 10s here, and today we're going to be talking about the top 10 facts that change how you see the story of the Mayflower. Number 10. The Pilgrims were actually escaping the religious tolerance of the Dutch. And trust me, they were not happy. The Pilgrims didn't flee religious persecution in England by going to America. They went to the Netherlands. Long before the Pilgrims stepped on board the Mayflower, they settled in a Dutch city called Leiden, where they were welcomed with open arms. The Dutch let them hold the Purdian services in their churches, promising that they will let all honest people live freely in their nation. And they did. The Dutch lived up to their promise, but the Purdians realized maybe religious freedom wasn't what they wanted after all. They complained about the extravagant and dangerous lifestyle of the Dutch, who they complained were deprived enough to spend part of the Sabbath not resting. The Purdians were worried that their children might be swept away by the deprived and wild lifestyle of doing work on the Sabbath. The young Purdians, William Bradford, wrote, "We're being drawn away by evil examples by the great licentious of youth in that country, and so they board the Mayflower, not to escape religious persecution, which they already escaped by going to the Netherlands, but to escape the religious tolerance of the Dutch." Number 9. French pilgrims went to America first, not actually the English pilgrims, just want to let you know. The Pilgrims on the Mayflower weren't the first people to have the idea. Some French sailors had already gone off to America in search of religious freedom 55 years before them. They didn't find it. Instead, they found the Spanish. And what happened what next makes a bit easier to understand why the Purdians didn't want to stay in Europe. The French set up a settlement called Fort Caroline and began living lives as Lutheran Protestants, away from all the religious wars of Europe, until Europe found them, of course. A Spanish army led by Pedro Menendez de Aviles tracked them down and killed them all for no other reason, and as we proudly explained, then for being Lutherans. The Spaniards attacked or climbed over the French walls with ladders, snuck into their bedrooms, and attacked. The French pilgrims' piousness was no match for the Spanish conquistadors' guns and their willingness to sneak into someone's bedroom and murder them in his sleep. 132 pilgrims had died, nearly every single person there, and the Spanish conquistadors named the fort Matanzas, being a massacre, to commemorate their favorite pastime. Number 8. A man put his kids on the Mayflower to spite his wife. And trust me, it's kind of ridiculous. The strangest names on the passenger list of the Mayflower were the Moore children, 4 occupied minors, all under 9-year-olds, sailing off to America without their parents. The Moores were the children of Samuel and Catherine Moore, or at least that's what Catherine told Samuel. As the kids grew older, though, Samuel started noticing that they didn't look very much like him. Instead, it looked an awful lot like Jacob Blakeway, the guy his wife kept insisting was just a friend. Samuel Moore divorced his wife, but under English law, he still had legal authority over his kids. He also absolutely hated his wife, so purely out of spite, he handed her kids off to the Purdians and bought them a one-way ticket on the Mayflower. All but one of the kids died during the first winter. The sole survivor was Richard Moore, who ended up selling in Salem. Apparently, he still had his biological father's genes. Years later, he was convicted for gross unchastity with another man's wife. Number 7. Less than half of the people on the Mayflower were Purdians. That's kind of ridiculous, huh? Despite how we imagined it, the Mayflower wasn't a boat full of Purdians. In fact, out of the 102 people on the boat, more than 60 were Anglicans, followers of the very religion the Purdians were trying to escape. The Purdians let the Anglicans come with them because they needed their money. Sailing 2 boats to the New World and set up a colony was expensive, and they needed investors. They made it clear, though, they weren't part of the group. They called these Angelicans strangers, and they called themselves saints. Those two boats, though, didn't pan out away. The others, the Speedwell, started leaking before they even got off the docks, and so all 102 people had to cram into the Mayflower. By the time they made it to Plymouth, there were only 32 Purdians left alive. Worried that they were going to fall into the devil's hands, the Purdians signed the Mayflower Compact with the strangers, letting them elect their own governors, and then made sure a Purdian was elected every time. Sounds unfair, right? Number 6, they landed at Plymouth because they were running out of beer. Sounds crazy, right? The Purdians weren't against a lot of things. Were against a lot of things, but beer wasn't one of them. They drank incredibly heavy. In fact, they bought more beer with them than water. Pretty much all the pilgrims drank was beer. All the pilgrims drank was beer. Water, they explained, spoiled quickly, which sounds like an alcoholic father's justification for brushing his teeth with a Pop's Blue Ribbon, or a Budweiser. By Christmas Day, after months of sailing in cramped quarters, starving, and being ridden by disease, a true tragedy struck. They were running out of beer. Oh my god. Well, they had to start rationing their supply, and to the pilgrims, this was a huge nightmare. We have divers times now and then some beer, William Bradford wrote in his journal, but they resorted to the unthinkable. We began to drink water aboard. People started complaining, so they kicked them off. The first settlers were dropped off at Plymouth and forced to drink water, because the people who stayed on the boat wanted to make sure there was enough beer for themselves. They didn't suffer long, though. They refused to. One of the very things the Pilgrims built was a brew house. Number 5. The Pilgrims robbed Native American graves. How rude are those Pilgrims? Very rude. When the Pilgrims landed, they expected to see a thriving Indian population all around them, but nobody was there. Other than the distant light for a few campfires at night, there wasn't any sign of life anywhere around them. They started to wander around, and they found empty towns full of corn, beans, and the bones of dead men. The natives had been wiped out by a plague, spread by the first Europeans to the area. It had wiped out between 90 and 96% of the people in southern New England, leaving behind nothing but empty towns full of supplies just waiting for the settlers to use them. The settlers, instead of being worried about the fact that the entire country had just been wiped out, took this as a sign of God's favor. John Winthrop called it a miracle, writing, "God hath cleared our title to this place." They took our corn, but more than that, they literally robbed their graves. One sailor wrote in his diary that he dug up a dead man's grave and fished out all the possessions he'd been buried with. "We took several of the prettiest things to carry away with us," he wrote, "and covered the corpse up again." Think of that. Number 4. The first Native American they asked for beer. I mean, why doesn't a Native American want beer? Not every Native American was dead. While the settlers were still setting up their camp, they made first contact with a Native American, who out of nowhere wandered into their camp and said in English, "Welcome, Englishmen." The man's name was Somerset. He met Englishmen before, and he picked up enough phrases to get by. He knew at least how to welcome an Englishman, and more importantly, how to ask them for beer. After he asked them enough times, the Plymouth colonists gave them strong water, which was enough to make them happy. Apparently, Somerset had a bit of a personality. After a while, they started politely hinting he should go home now, but they couldn't figure out how to get rid of him. They ended up letting him sleep off the strong water in their camp, which paid off. Somerset would ultimately save their lives several times and help them make peace treaties with the Wampanoag tribe. He also sold some of the first land in America to the Plymouth settlers, which probably wasn't his to sell, but certainly gave the settlers a signature they could use to call the land their own. Number 3. Squanto had been sold into slavery several times. I would say that's bad. Somerset told the settlers about Squanto, a man in his tribe who could speak English even better than he could. He wasn't lying. Squanto spoke English nearly as well as the Englishmen themselves. There was a reason. 6 years before, Squanto had met another famous sailor, Thomas Hunt, John Smith's successor at the Jamestown colony. Hunt had kidnapped him and 23 other natives and sold them into slavery in Spain. From there, Squanto was sold again to an Englishman who taught him to English and brought him to Newfoundland to work as his interpreter. While in Newfoundland, he was sold again, this time to Thomas Dermer, who took him to Massachusetts. By miracle chance, Squanto made it back to his home. By the time he arrived, though, everyone he known was dead, wiped out by the plague. Squanto ended up with the Wampanoag when Dermer was taken hostage. He won his freedom and in an act of mercy convinced them to let Dermer go alive, and that was how he ended up the tribe's interpreter to the Plymouth colony, a colony that was built, as he realized when he met them, directly on top of his family's grave. Interesting, right? Number 2, Squanto went mad with power, like really, really powerful. Squanto never extracted revenge on the settlers. Instead, he helped them so much that without his help, some believe the settlers wouldn't have survived. He taught them to grow maize, which is another word for corn, to catch eels, and help them negotiate with the nearby tribes. In time, though, he got a little carried away. He was the tribe's connection with the European settlers, and that made him their connection to guns and technology. He started making people give him gifts in exchange for a few good words with English, and at least once threatened that if they didn't do what he said, he would make the Englishmen release the plague again. One of his tricks went too far. He got mad at Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag tribe, and decided this time he was going to show them he was bluffing. He really got the Englishmen to kill him, so he tricked the Englishmen into believed that Massasoit was planning to kill them all, trying to convince them to strike him first. When they realized it was all made up, Massasoit demanded Squanto's head. The Englishmen were going to do it too, but when they realized how doomed they were without his help, they had to side with Squanto, who it turns out really was important as he thought he was. Number 1, they hung a dead man's head over their fort. Look, I wouldn't go there, right? Peace didn't last long, even with all the empty villages around them, and the help of people like Squanto and Somerset. The settlers were starving. It was just a matter of time before the harshness of life broke out into war, and when it did, it was brutal. Things were particularly bad in the nearby Wasagasset settlement. They were starving so badly that one of their pilgrims stole corn for the Pequot tribe. They agreed to hang him for it. They needed the help of their native neighbors so badly that they were willing to kill their own people. The Pequot tribe, though, wasn't totally satisfied, and a rumor that they were planning to destroy the right presence in America reached the Plymouth colony. It was some sort of rumor they ignored before when Squanto spread it, but they've been in America for a few years now, and they were harder, more cynical people. So a group from the Plymouth colony, led by Miles Standish, took care of it. They invited the best warriors from the Pequot tribe over for dinner. Then they locked the door, stabbed them to death, chopped off the chief's brother's head, and placed it on the roof of a blockhouse next to flag made from a cloth soaked in blood. That is pretty bad. That is probably why I wouldn't meet the Purdians at all. Well, if I was an Indian, which I ain't. Alright guys, that is it. Hopefully you guys liked this Lalone Top 10s presentation. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and see you guys next time. Take care.